Reconsidering the Urban and Urban Education, Interdisciplinary Conversations by Edward Buendia. In this presentation, I will be discussing the purpose of the article, the research that it included, as well as the possible solutions for studying the education systems. I will first begin by defining the term urban education. Many of us may not understand the innards of the title alone. The dictionary definition of urban is simply a term pertaining to a city or town. In everyday parlance or dialogue, the term is used frequently to distinguish something from the term rural, small town, suburban, or exurban. These objective size density definitions, however, do not convey the range of meanings intended or received when the term is most commonly used. The perceptions of urban areas differ widely. This definitely parallels to the shift between the 20th century Industrial Revolution to today. Urban areas were viewed by many as economically dynamic, attracting and employing migrant populations from small towns, rural areas, and abroad. Urban then became a derogatory code word for the problems caused by the large numbers of poor and minorities who live in cities. Such negative associations with the term urban profoundly affect education and shape the nature of urban schooling. Urban schools is defined as education facilities that provide education to students who live in metropolitan areas. They exist within a large bureaucratic school system that may occasionally lack resources required to handle various challenges in educating every student. In other words, budding equity versus equality. Urban education in ethnic inner cities is a large, densely populated cities such as Chicago, Boston, New York, Los Angeles. City schools are often characterized by large, diverse populations, many poor students, budget shortages, and bureaucracy. In this particular reading, Buendia proposes the writing of this article was identify and discuss the research process approaches through fresh theoretical and empirical strategies through discussing the classificatory schemes placed upon people. Buendia challenges the way the education system describes school in metropolitan area. He has a couple arguments that begin to unfold a new way educators, students, the public, and most importantly, the educational systems ought to implement in their discourse. He first begins by stating that the construct of label does not only give meaning to a place, but also the population that resides in that area. He also argues that social science texts interconnected the domain of cultural and spatial, i.e., geographical and structure of the lands outside, such as race or even immigrants. Buendia's social focus is the mere converging aspects of academic and non-academic conversations that shape our understanding of urban subject. Buendia talks about educators, researchers, and policymakers have established urban education as a central theme and focus in educational research over the course of the last 40 or so years, similar to sub-disciplinary areas such as literacy, teacher education, or science education. Urban education research has come to the defined cluster of acceptable research domains, theories, and methods in which to study ethnically and racially diverse students, schools, classrooms that are located within metropolitan centers. Two titles of approval, the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESA, Title I, and the 1966 release of the Equality of Educational Opportunity Study, or Coleman Study, open doors for new conversations of national debates, initiatives, and research programs aimed to address the depressing educational outcomes of social economic populations. For example, Buendia talks about the historical origins of institutionalization of the urban and suburban states of subject and space. He writes about the K-12 U.S. academic structures that need to engage in a discussion of the poor and racial other, as well as the location or place in which these populations reside. Many educational researchers focus on the place and people dealing with dysfunctional families, zones of blight, the disease center, the violent, to the at-risk. In such studies, the educational gap of ethnicity and racially diverse students are framed as the effects of dysfunctional family and ecological environments. This created a separation of people through misinformation and quite possibly agenda-based. The disturbing factor to the policy and research text was that they concluded that the circumstances of the problem led not within the social organization of institutions, but within the lower socioeconomic status or low SES black family or what deemed to be urban family students. The report argued that it was an issue of culture or family and group practices and behaviors which reproduced the downward cycles of poverty. The one produced outcomes was that they educated the policy markers, practicing educators, students, as well as population about the educational gaps between the poor and middle class. This allows ourselves to be educated about the research in this area of urban study. That the term urban has been reduced to racial, economic, cultural, and spatial attributes that are seen as image. The public now has a picture of an impoverished racial immigrant subject that has correlated their existence to a geographical space, i.e. urban cities. According to a couple of texts, the 1970 corporations that survived the industrial shift also followed the suit by moving their corporate headquarters and fabrication centers to areas outside of the city centers. As a result, the economic and governmental infrastructure tied to corporations left many inner cities without an economic base. Educational institutions, too, became the key sites where suburban and urban split was institutionalized as both a material and legal divide to maintain what is framed as a natural separation between blacks and whites. This image here is the courtesy of Ernest Burgess and Robert Park from 1925. It is the centric zone, the model of that Chicago professors used. So moving forth, the Brown versus Board education had begun in 1954, desegregating southern and northern city school districts. Many outlying white residential areas initiated succession movement that sought to insert a legal and economic separation from cities. Basically, they could sidestep court orders to assimilate by becoming separate cities. That is, these extensions of cities could legally codified as not city, urban, or space. As a result, residents and local state government enacted a series of built environments of cities that had judicial and economic and representational battles. Many state and city planners built beltways and railroad lines that divided physically what was imagined as the suburban and inner city spaces. This image here is in Washington. It is a beltway line, and it is called the Brown, which is very controversial in that area. These acts also affected the financing of schools. Many white suburban residents sought to further distinguish suburban schools from any inner city schools. While people investigating the discourses of the integrity of the suburban community, subject, and space, white suburban-based politicians structured school funding patterns to correspond to the tax revenue generated from their respective city and suburban districts. However, discussing this could even inspire one another to get involved in our community. Change starts with the present. Moving forward to what can be implemented, it is crucial to understand that the structure of the urban and suburban cities has tended to be a pervasive cultural framework. The demographic trends and social forces behind the changing from the cities has exhausted the usefulness of this framework as an analytical tool for understanding how it functions. Many theorists have highlighted that the city space, as well as identity of its subject, does not have a natural order. Cultural geographers and sociologists working from Marxist as well as post-Marxist frameworks have identified how the organization of cities and its subjects are found by the economic as well as cultural forces. They have documented how spaces are affected by intersecting forces such as various forms of capital, city politics, as well as cultural representations of people and space, i.e., shopping centers, restaurants, and homes. With this research, we can see that urban study has oriented other interdisciplinary conversations to account for the multidimensional and socially produced elements of city spaces. We are in large affected by it all. It is something produced, practiced, and continuously secreted within the myriad of relations that constitute the built environment and the social representations of place and people. It is not in our true nature to segregate one another. It simply has been indoctrinated into our being. So what can we do? Buendia has suggested that we rethink the city, its institutions, and people, as well as the underlying concept of space. He has added these 3 exemplar studies that focus on a new approach to studying urban education. 3 researchers have created various educational studies that have seized upon this reconceptualization and attempted to reorient where future educational research might go in present urban education. They may not be the end result, but they are to be seen as a means of evolving or a way to inform the process of question towards a more responsive outcome to socio-educational issues in our society. The works of Pedro Nogueira studies Oakland-Berkeley schools. He links the patterns of educational inequality to the geographic, economic, and demographic elements in each city. He examines the distribution of economic resources as well as the pockets of isolations that emerge from a built environment of interconnected neighborhoods. His study included 2 neighborhoods that were close to one another. Many of the residents that lived near one another varied by the means of socioeconomic scale. Many of the inhabitants on the lower end of socioeconomics did not perform as well as the other candidates in their education. The cityscapes that leave many groups physically isolated and without social resources and capital to make organized demands of the city's schools, that was seen as a privilege. In the next study, Lippmann's study was active within Chicago public school districts that focused on the global flow of capital and the social production of unequal educational spaces. She focuses on educational programs that are attempting to restructure citywide institutions. She found that Chicago's bureaucrat-organized discourse of the global city, conceptualized as a city center for a new global informational economy as a way to structure the dual movement of selling the city and structuring school accountability to attract global institutions of commerce. What does that mean exactly? The city's commerce and political machinery are passing resources to specific areas of two Chicago neighborhoods, those that are well off and white, in order to continue manufacture. This study has allowed us to understand how processes of segmentation complicate translation of cities as binaries of suburban and urban locations. Lippmann's analytical framework, as she demonstrates how the multiple interactions of discourse and structures produce differentiated spaces and subjects. The last study, Popowitz, studies the difference between academic discourses that have overlapped and fused as systems of reasoning, which unveils the ability of the categories of the urban and rural student that have become more core concepts in educational discourse. He focuses on the present systems that educators implement and turn to the practice of space, representational in the proceeding. He argues that educators evoke the language of urban and rural students, youth, and schools that construct space in what he terms of grids of intelligibility or accuracy, in which bodies are placed to produce individuals. He simply suggests that the space of otherness is a perception of lies that makes distinctions between students that are constructed by discourse. Whether or not readers agree with Popowitz's postmodern approach to study the production of urban, rural, and suburban student, his work pushes educational researchers to seriously reconsider the way that we employ these constructs. He avoids the issues of whether poverty has effects on student learning or the social or cultural capital that they bring to educational enterprises, but he focuses on their own practices and nudges the field, similar to what cultural geographers have done in their discipline, to interrogate the units of analysis that have become the central knowledge elements that frame our conversations. Nogueira's approach to study schools focuses on smaller neighborhood units and pattern of racially diverse, poverty-stricken neighborhoods, while Lippmann's study looks into where the money is and where it travels. Popowitz's study concentrated on how the content knowledge selected at schools, i.e. math, sciences, and spelling, work in tandem with systems of reasoning to define competency and ability. Those these articles are not to answer the education in its whole, it pushes the educational research to reconsider the way we employ urban, rural, and space in our practices. These articles also allow readers to get a general understanding of their community, educational system, and perhaps even politics through an introduction to educational constructs. And this article has sought to identify the converging lines of academic and popular conversations, as well as texts that have come to shape our theoretical and empirical work of urban space and urban subject. Buendia has hypothesized that this area of study has also portrayed a concept of the urban subject that views it nearly as poor or black or Latino, living a nightmare of dysfunctionality and chaos. This analysis is aimed at critiquing our own practices from within. While discovering the genealogical lines of urban construct, he has also pushed the field of study to turning to exemplars, both in and out of the field. In this course thus far, we have been introduced to the social foundations of education. We have read and discussed many articles that have offered a myriad of studies that file social factors that have a rippling effect on society, simply by the means of education. This has allowed educators, learners, and perhaps the public the opportunity to resolve composition to work toward a better contemporary. This article relates to schooling, teaching, learning, and education in general because we are directly dealing with this today. Though it may not be segregated as it was 40 years ago, we still hear the echo in Fighting the Unaware. The parallel between the research texts and the Hollywood are interesting to draw conclusions from. We have learned social constructs through mimicking what we see or hear, and movies we are way to misguide our public. It is our duty as pre-service educators and learners to advance forward in our educational practices. Such as this course, the social foundation of education may guide our eyes to the new perception that will enhance our present and future generations.